In 2024, when a European country could not develop a defense system domestically, it was 3 times more likely to buy it in the US than to buy it from any one of its European neighbors. The US defense industry is simply more developed, giving them higher economies of scale, which causes their products to often be a bit cheaper upfront and even gives them quicker delivery times. However, what's perhaps even more important is that buying US gets you a massive thumbs up from the US government, as well as, in some cases, it gives you access to some very cheap US loans. These advantages of the US defense industry over the European one bring us to the core question of this video. What is the role of the European Union when it comes to defense?
The European Union was formed in order to screw with the United States. That's the purpose of it.
In the 50s, the European Union started out as an industrial collaboration on coal and steel. And industrial collaboration is exactly where it is needed right now in the field of defense. In facing Europe's defense industrial challenges, the European Union has started taking on some tasks where the member states are falling short. Now, before we delve into these initiatives, we have to remember that when it comes to defense, the European Union is actually fighting with one arm tied behind its back. Because Article 41 of its founding treaty explicitly forbids the EU's budget to be used for anything which comes even close to defense purposes. So the Commission has to act very strategically. It has to take on Europe's defense industrial challenges without treading on any national sensitivities, as this will always result in vetoes. And in doing this, the von der Leyen Commission has actually been relatively successful. In this video, I will take you through 4 key EU initiatives. First off, we have the European Defence Fund, which aims at strengthening Europe's efforts when it comes to military research and development. Next up, we have the European Defence Industrial Programme. This aims to tackle Europe's shortfalls when it comes to military production. Then we have the Rearm Europe plan. This plan was presented earlier this year by the Commission, and it aims at boosting the national investments in Europe's defence industry. And finally, we have the European Peace Facility. This one is mainly known as the tool used to reimburse nations for their support to Ukraine, but actually it does quite a lot more. Now, these initiatives are all very young, heavily underdeveloped, and they contain plenty of flaws, but they are also essential. Because these are the only systems in place which will make sure that these defense budgets will not go straight across the Atlantic like they have done in the past. Okay, let's start off with the oldest of the bunch, even though it's only from 2021, the European Defence Fund. This fund focuses on research and development. And it functions both as a Kickstarter for the private sector, as well as an incentive for European nations to develop together instead of researching the same technologies next to each other. Now, why does the EU need to take on these tasks? Why can't it just leave this to the member states? To find this out, we need to have a closer look at how European countries are investing their defense budgets. In 2024, European nations together, when adjusted to purchasing power parity, spent about the same on their defense as the Russians did. However, in that same year, only about 4% of that budget went to R&D. When we compare this to Russia, they spend about 10% of their defense budgets towards R&D. And when we make the comparison with China and the US, the difference becomes even more evident. So why are these European countries investing so little? Of course, when you're buying US weapon systems, then you don't have to pay money to develop them yourself, but there's actually more to it than that. Europe's defense budgets have risen substantially over the last years, but these increases were aimed mostly at the mid to short-term defense of Ukraine, and in doing so it was far more important to upgrade and upscale the production of already existing systems than to start developing new ones, which usually takes about 5 to 10 years in order to result in battlefield advantages. However, in the long run, with Europe planning on spending 5% of its GDP towards defense, this lack of R&D could really undercut Europe's potential as a defense industrial player. Now, how does this fund work? As I said, the first task of the EDF is to provide Kickstarter funding for large-scale European R&D projects. The Achilles heel of Europe's limited defense R&D budgets lie within their first stage, the so-called research and technology stage. This covers basic research and demonstrations which show the technology itself is viable. This stage is actually quite expensive, and because it is the first stage, it also has the least amount of guarantees that the project will actually get made, never mind it being profitable. The uncertainty of this stage makes it a very uncertain investment for private actors. This is why states have to step in, but as we have seen, European nations have relucted to do so. And this is why the EU is stepping in, hoping that their Kickstarter funding will later result in the stream of private investment. That being said, let's take a look at one project for which this Kickstarter funding was deemed crucial. Meet Project Odin's Eye. This ambitious project could become Europe's first space-based missile early warning system. Right now, the only country within NATO to have such a system is the US, making it a crucial strategic enabler in Europe's quest towards autonomy from the US. The project is led by Germany's OHB Systems, and it unites 43 different companies from 14 different countries in order to create a European constellation of satellites which are able to detect both traditional ballistic missiles as well as hypersonic missiles. The project will be terminating its design phase later this year, and during the course of 2026, European nations will be able to buy in, starting from the production phase. Let's now look at the broader task of the EDF, making joint R&D simply more attractive towards the member states. The benefits of joint development are quite clear. The risks of developing are getting spread out between the different nations, and because all of these nations buy in, the market becomes larger, meaning a larger economy of scale, meaning the product becomes cheaper, meaning the product also becomes more interesting towards the export market, all of which means a larger return on investment and a larger interoperability between all of these European armies who use these systems. This is the good part of the story, because the EDF has also faced some strong criticism. An interim evaluation of the program has revealed several crucial problems. The main criticism the EDF faces is that its relatively small yearly budget is spread too thinly across too many different projects, meaning its impact on each one of these projects is simply too small. Or as one German official puts it, the EDF's ambitions are not matched by its resources, and its incentives are too small to really impact market behavior. One example of a development which highlights these problems I have already mentioned in the previous video is the Eurodrone. The Eurodrone is a long-distance, high-capacity ISR drone developed by Airbus, Dassault and Leonardo. This joint program involves Germany, France, Italy and Spain. As is often the case with multinational European defense projects, this one was heavily troubled by disagreements between the participating nations. And if these discussions weren't enough, each time a decision was made on a capability, this was followed by a massive row on which company got to produce that specific part of the system. Now, while it is normal that these discussions take place, in the case of the Eurodrone, it caused the program to be delayed for over 5 years, as well as it adding 50% to the original budget. A common fund could have forced this project to use a standardized way of working. However, the EDF's contribution to the project only accounted for about 1.3%, which is simply not enough. So in summary, while the EDF succeeds in being a Kickstarter for R&D projects, it does not succeed in making joint R&D projects more efficient and more attractive towards the member states. Secondly, we have the European Defence Industry Programme, EDIP. Where the EDF focuses on common development, EDIP focuses on common production. EDIP will only come into effect later this year, but it originated in 2023 when the European Union launched ASAP, the Act in Support of Ammunition Production. This emergency fund of 500 million euros was aimed to quickly boost Europe's production of 155mm artillery shells for Ukraine, which at that point had a massive shortage. ASAP's funds focused on upstream bottlenecks, which means that about 3/4 of the money went to propellant powder and high explosives, because these two elements were simply more difficult to scale up than the other aspects of artillery shell production, such as the molding of the shells themselves. Now, where did this money go? In total, 31 beneficiaries were selected across 15 different European nations. The single largest beneficiary of the fund was Rheinmetall. It secured over 1/4 of the total funds. However, it isn't only using these funds in Germany, but also for its production sites in Hungary, Romania and Spain. The EU's efforts, in coordination with those of the member states, can be seen as a relative success. The total production of the 155mm shell doubled over the next year, and by the end of this year, it is expected that the European Union will produce about 1 million of these shells, which is relatively impressive. Ukraine's domestic production of this particular shell type only started last year, but it is also quickly picking up speed. So even with less US material support, the worst part of the 155mm crisis seems to have been averted. To be clear, we're only talking about one particular kind of ammunition. Ukraine right now is still lacking a whole lot of other types of ammunition, not in the least of which are Patriot missiles, but that is not for the scope of this video. Because ASAP is an emergency measure, its time frame is relatively limited, and its measures will end later this year. Now, building on the success of ASAP, the European Union has proposed EDIP as a permanent measure. Just like the European Defence Fund, EDIP finds its legal basis in the EU's single market powers. By treating this as an industry problem rather than a defense problem, it is able to circumvent the EU's restrictions on defense policies. In essence, EDIP extends ASAP's functionality of directly co-funding the industry. One of the ways in which the EU will do this is by funding ever-warm production lines, which means that certain production lines will be reserved even during peacetime when production is low. So when a conflict does break out, the EU can scale up its output relatively quickly. One of the major differences between ASAP and EDIP is that EDIP's €1.5 billion budget over the next 2 years will not just be spent on a specific type of ammunition. Instead, the European Union will focus on everything it deems as critical defense goods. However, what it considers critical defense products is rather vague, and ultimately this will be decided by the Industrial Readiness Board. This board consists of the Commission, the High Representative Kaja Kallas, and one representative of each member state. Now, this could also be EDIP's downfall, because one of the major advantages of ASAP was that it was very focused. It was about one specific type of ammunition and two bottlenecks which hampered the production of this ammunition. The Commission has to be careful that it doesn't make the same mistakes it made with the EDF. It cannot overextend itself, because this would also mean that the impact towards each product, towards each initiative would be very small, and then it would just become another subsidy scheme with no impact whatsoever. Let's now have a look at Europe's most recently announced initiative, the Rearm Europe plan. Whereas the EDF and EDIP are focused on strengthening one specific part of the European defense industry, the Rearm Europe plan is more broad in its scope, and it aims to free up European money for defense in general. The Rearm Europe plan talks about way bigger figures than the EDF or EDIP, but as opposed to those plans, the Rearm Europe plan is not financed directly with the EU's budget. Instead, it uses the EU's budget indirectly as a security to raise capital on the private market. And by doing this, once again, it can circumvent Article 41. Rearm Europe consists of 3 pillars. You have the safe loan instrument, the fiscal flexibility part, and the investment mobilization aspect. The safe loan instrument will raise up to 150 billion euros on capital markets by using the EU's budget as a security. Safe financing will require at least 65% domestic content, which means that 65% of the procurement needs to come from European suppliers, including the UK and Ukraine. In reality, most of these loans will go towards Eastern European countries and the Baltics. This is because they have less access to cheap capital than Western European countries. This is because their industries are still less developed than the Western European industries, as well as, certainly with the Baltics, the very risk of a Russian invasion makes it a more risky investment for the capital markets, and therefore they have to ask a higher price for their capital. On the other side, it is exactly because of this risk of invasion and the vicinity to Russia that these countries spend so much on their defense. So on one hand, they need investment the most, and on the other hand, they have the most difficulties of getting that cheap capital. Secondly, we have the fiscal flexibility part of the Rearm Europe plan. This means the EU can invoke its national escape clause from its budgetary restraints for the member states. And this is where that magnificent 650 billion euro amount comes from. It is actually simply the EU allowing member states to borrow more for defense. And finally, we have the aspect of investment mobilization. The European Investment Bank has historically always steered clear of military projects. However, right now it will be encouraged to also include projects of a military or security nature. This spring, US diplomats and lawmakers, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, have warned the EU against excluding US defense companies from these defense initiatives. On the one hand, the US wants European nations to spend 5% of their GDP towards defense, creating the largest defense budget in the world, larger than the US defense budget. On the other hand, it is quite clear that the US also wants the US defense industry to be the biggest beneficiary of these increased funds. On the surface, this criticism looks correct. Both the EDF, EDIP, as well as Rearm Europe are all actively discriminating against non-European companies. However, in the field of defense, this form of protectionism is actually quite normal, and there's nothing inherently wrong with it. And to go even one step further, the US routinely does exactly the same thing. And not just in the US itself, where defense spending is very clearly tied to a Buy American strategy. But the US also does exactly the same thing with its European partners. For this, we have to look at the US's foreign military financing program. Poland is the prime example. Via this program, they have received about 7 billion worth of direct loans over the course of 2023 and 2024, and another 4 billion in loan guarantees. The US does not hand out these loans in order for Poland to go buy French Rafale planes or Belgian FN guns. Instead, these loans were meant exclusively for US defense equipment, such as Apache helicopters and F-35 fighter jets. And the US can absolutely do so. Export finance is something which is relatively normal in the world of international arms trade. However, the US cannot credibly stop the EU from doing the same thing. By doing this, the European Commission is mimicking a part of the US defense industrial playbook, and therefore it is showing the world that it is losing its naivety when it comes to its defense industry. Finally, we have the European Peace Facility, or the EPF. As opposed to what its name suggests, this is actually Europe's main military funding tool outside of NATO. And one of its main perks is that it sits outside of the regular EU budget. This is, of course, once again because of Article 41. The EPF has two main goals. Its first goal is to fund the EU's ongoing military missions, such as Operation Atalanta, for example, which tackles piracy off the coasts of Somalia, or Operation Irini, which enforces the United Nations arms embargo upon Libya. There have actually been quite a few of these missions, but they've often faced criticisms for not being very effective or for not clearly serving European needs. Now, one mission which has been seen as a clear success is the military assistance mission to Ukraine. This mission has trained over 70,000 Ukrainian troops with Western military systems and modern battlefield tactics. So funding these EU military missions is the first focus of the EPF. Now, the second focus is on helping partner countries fund their militaries. Now, since February 2022, this has primarily been Ukraine. How the system works is rather unique. It's a sort of cashback system for governments, where countries can donate their tanks, missiles and air defense systems, and they can get a part of the value back from the EPF, so that the burden of helping Ukraine doesn't fall only on those countries who have systems to spare. So far, European countries have allocated over 11 billion euros to the EPF for Ukraine. This funding has been a lifeline for Kiev, especially with US aid slowing down over the last year. European countries could simply give a lot more, knowing that they would get part of the value of these systems back, which in turn they could reinvest into new systems. However, it hasn't all been smooth sailing for the EPF, and the last 2 years it has come into some murky waters. It started off with some technical disagreements. France, for example, didn't want the EPF to refund non-European weapons. This as a further incentive for European countries to buy European defense systems. France ultimately conceded on this demand because it became clear that Europe's defense industry could not provide everything Ukraine needed on a shorthand basis. Now, France has indicated that when it comes to negotiating a follow-up to the EPF, it will really press on this buy European demand. However, the real killer of the EPF in regards to helping out Ukraine became Hungary. Mid-2023, Hungary started actively blocking each decision by the European Peace Facility. And because the European Peace Facility requires unanimous decision-making, Hungary was able to block over 6.6 billion euros worth of reimbursements. So Brussels had to prepare a backup plan, and it did this via the Ukraine Loan Cooperation Mechanism. With this mechanism, the EU can hand out loans to Ukraine and help Ukraine pay them back via the profit it gets from the frozen Russian assets with European banks. While this is a good way of helping Ukraine in the short run, as well as spreading the risks of reusing these Russian assets, it is not a structural solution to the problems of the EPF. The most obvious way in which the problems of the EPF could be fixed would be a treaty change towards qualified majority voting, but this is simply not feasible right now, as defense is still very much seen as a national affair. Although in the latest months we have all seen how strong and independent this national approach has made European countries. A more realistic option would be the setting up of a dedicated Ukraine security fund, also outside of the EU's budget, where a coalition of willing countries could help support Ukraine's war efforts. This would basically be a copy-paste of the European Peace Facility as it is right now, but focused only on Ukraine. This way, countries who don't agree on supporting Ukraine's war effort, like Hungary and perhaps in the future Slovakia, should simply not join that fund. The scope of the Ukraine war absolutely warrants this, and this way the EPF could keep its focus on its other missions and partners, which some critics say it has been neglecting over the last years. So those were the 4 most important EU defense initiatives right now. Of course, I could not cover every EU initiative within the scope of this video. One element which I left out is Pesco. This initiative, aimed at a permanent, structured cooperation between the different nations on capability development, was all the rage when I was at university. However, it hasn't delivered any strong, tangible results since then, and that's why I haven't featured it in this video. Another important program with strong defense implications is of course the European Space Agency. I haven't featured it in this video because it's not officially a defense program. However, over the last years, ESA is clearly moving in that direction. To conclude this video, before the war in Ukraine, in times of business as usual, the EU was trying to do everything at once. Things like Pesco, the EU's scattered military operations, and I haven't even mentioned the never-used EU battle groups. The EU had defense initiatives all over the place, but they all turned out to be little more than paper tigers. The war in Ukraine and Trump's second presidency have really helped the EU refocus its efforts. With Assad, the EU has shown that when it's given a very clearly defined industrial target, Brussels can absolutely deliver. With its safe loans under Rearm Europe, it is even borrowing directly from the US military-industrial playbook. A few years ago, Brussels might have bowed down to US pressure on this, and it might have dismissed the whole program as being protectionist. Now, Brussels takes note of Washington's opposition and moves forward. And it absolutely has to, because this is the only way for Europe to consolidate its fragmented defense industry. Only then will European companies be able to outcompete the US military-industrial complex. And only then will the 5% pledged by European leaders to defense actually benefit European companies. However, under the risk of sounding needlessly critical, one question I ask myself is, if the war in Ukraine ends tomorrow and the US elects a more moderate-sounding president, will the EU double down on these issues, and will it continue its quest towards strategic autonomy, or will it revert to business as usual? Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you found it interesting, feel free to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the quest towards European strategic autonomy.